PhoneGap introduction brown bag session. My name is Matt Ray. I'm Senior Software Engineer at eImagine Technology. Today we're going to be covering at a pretty high level. We'll keep it to kind of a 100 level course, so to speak, of PhoneGap and what it is and when to use it and maybe when not to use it. There will be a few code examples, and I know that some of the people that are watching and attending this are not necessarily hard code developers, but don't worry. The idea is to really get a background on this and to understand when you might even apply this from a PM perspective and make that suggestion. Oh, maybe you want to apply this to this mobile project, and just to be aware of what can be done. So the goal is to be conversant on PhoneGap, particularly for us as it relates to the ETG mobile app and future apps moving forward. So this is kind of what we'll be covering today. This is our contents. So first, the state of mobile, the case for PhoneGap, getting started. So how, if you actually want to get involved in this, how to do so moving forward. And then some specific examples, database access, tapping into web services, and kind of putting it all together. And then eventually with a conclusion. I'd encourage you to kind of jot down notes, any questions you have, and just hold those to the end, if you would, please. So first of all, the state of mobile, where are we at? So to really understand the context of why PhoneGap exists, you have to understand maybe the problem that it's a solution for. So you have multiple platforms, BlackBerry, the Windows Phone, Android, and iPhone, just to name a few. There's actually a pretty big list of even platforms that are not covered here. With each one, they have their own look and feel, and they have their own operating system with SDKs, and those are software development kits, which means that to develop against them, you kind of have to target each individual one. Now, there's some crossover, like BlackBerry and Android, they all kind of support Java, but you still kind of have to know this is the device I'm targeting, these are the rules for that device. So it becomes problematic if you want to deploy something, for instance, like our internal app that we use here, across every device type. You could really spend a lot of time redoing code over and over again in different languages just to make that happen. Obviously, especially with an internal application, the less time you can spend doing something like that, the better. Like I said, there's multiple development languages, and these are, again, just a few that cover it. Java. The little icon on the right is for the iOS Xcode program, which is also used to code Mac software. And then I know that we, at least here, are very familiar with Visual Studio. So again, having to hold each one of those up and target those platforms just becomes a little problematic at times if it's unnecessary. So these are development caveats. So for Windows Phone development, for instance, you have to run the latest version of Visual Studio to do that. And that means in order to get that on your system, you have to be running Windows 8. Otherwise, it will not work. So, you know, this is a way that these companies kind of lock you in a little bit to their platform, and it's understandable, but it is what it is. With iOS, for instance, you have to be developing on a Mac platform, which means hardware and software. You can develop, you know, a lot of solutions. You can do it in a kind of a VM'd environment, but Xcode behaves pretty wildly in that kind of sense. So that means, again, you're going to have to run a Mac environment, a Windows environment, and then for Android, which is Data here, our favorite Android from Star Trek, Android's kind of the difference. They have where you can run on Mac or Windows or even Linux if that's your flavor. So here's really the case for PhoneGap. And like I said at the top of this, there are cases when you may not want to use PhoneGap, but this is really the situation where you say, okay, you know what, this is a good fit. You have some flexibility in the UI. And what that means is, for instance, if you've seen an Android app, they tend to have a look and feel that's consistent across apps. If you look at iOS apps, they tend to have a look and feel. So that the bar at the top with the arrows, the back button maybe, there's a toolbar maybe at the very bottom. And actually each platform publishes a style guide. So they say, you know what, if you're going to develop on our platform, we'd like for you to adhere to these rules. And you can look those up online. They're really easy to search for. But if you say, you know what, my client doesn't really care that it adheres to a specific platform guideline, we actually want it to look the same across all platforms so that each user, no matter what device type they're on, has that same experience. This is probably a good fit. And then again, you have a consistent look and feel, same thing. You're just kind of spreading that across the platforms. You are targeting multiple platforms. If you're really targeting just one and it's not in a prototype situation, you might actually just want to use the native development tool, whether it's Xcode, Visual Studio, or something like that. You'll get, probably a lot cleaner result and maybe a more expected result from people who are used to seeing that kind of app. Speed to delivery is a really good kind of component here. I use PhoneGap a lot for prototyping. So if there's a demo coming up and they say, they want to see what it might look like, you know what? It's a lot faster for me to rip through some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to quickly mock up some screens, almost in a wireframing sense, than it is for me to deep dive into Objective-C, for instance, and start laying out screens in those tools. They're a little more cumbersome at times. And then the last one is you have little or no background processing. So this is a kind of a little gotcha. Because PhoneGap is based on HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and it's essentially using a browser interface embedded in the app, it does not like to be put in the background. So if you have long-running tasks and you want them to be able to app switch back and forth while those are happening, that could be a consideration. You may say, oh, you know what, we don't really have a choice here. We have to go native. But if you say, you know what, that's not going to have a lot of background processes, not a lot of data crunching happening invisibly, asynchronously behind the scenes, this could be a really good fit. The cool thing is that, your PhoneGap app can look and feel just like a native one with a lot of the kind of frameworks that are out there, UI frameworks. So jQuery Mobile is one of them. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. If you've seen them, if you've looked on some websites, you've seen these frameworks out there. And it's compatible with all of them as long as they're kind of CSS and JavaScript compatible. So how do you get started? Okay, you know what, Matt, you sold me on this. I want to try a PhoneGap app. How do I get started? So there's a platform SDK that has to be downloaded. If you're on Windows and you're wanting to do kind of testing in Visual Studio, guess what? That means getting Visual Studio with the kind of Windows 8, the mobile SDKs. And then if you're on Mac, you're going to want to make sure Xcode's installed so that it can compile ultimately down to the device and put that on your mobile phone so that you can test it. And then the second piece here is the PhoneGap framework itself. So it's kind of a series of libraries that comes down and installs on your machine so that you can build out to whatever platform you want. So you have kind of a choice, and I'll show you more of that in just a moment. One of the big things that I didn't list here, and it's becoming a little more ubiquitous as we go along, you may be familiar with a system called Node.js. That's N-O-D-E. So it's got kind of it's a little bit of a middleware, and it allows you to very quickly install packages and do kind of JavaScript-ish development and coding on your system. One of the things that PhoneGap recently did is they moved to Node.js as their installation package just to simplify things. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment, but it's literally you go to Node.js's website, download the executable, run it, and then you can follow the instructions kind of to get the platform installed, PhoneGap installed, things like that. It sounds probably more rigorous than it is, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like here in just a moment. Can't see that screen? That's right. It's a super blurry picture. So this is actually a video, and for a moment, I'm actually going to switch back to my main screen here. And I'll show you exactly what it looks like to install. Okay, so I've already queued this up. Oh, sorry, let me move this over here so you can see it. Switch screens here. So NPM, which is Node Package Manager, I've already installed Node on here, and I literally can type this out for you again. It was not very hard. The NPM install PhoneGap. So you're just saying, I want you to install PhoneGap. It knows from the kind of list of sources that it has built into it what PhoneGap is, where to go get it. So with an active internet connection, I can hit that, and you can see the URLs. It's actually going out, grabbing the source down, doing compilation. And so this task takes probably upwards of like 30 seconds So not a long amount of time, so you really don't have to worry too much about this taking all day like some software packages take. And you're seeing a lot of dependencies. Don't freak out if you're not used to doing command line software installs. They go, oh, what's it doing? Just don't panic. Let it finish. It'll let you know when it's done, and then you'll have PhoneGap on your system. And you'll be able to run the rest of these commands. And I'm just going to let that sit and marinate for a moment. Oh, see, it's done already. So that takes us to creating a project. And as Picard would say, make it so. So once PhoneGap's installed, you can then use PhoneGap from the command line. And in this case, it's PhoneGap create, and then whatever the name of the app that you want to create, and it will create it in that directory. Another awesome blurry picture that cues me to load this back up. And I've already got a tab set up to do this, and I literally just did what it said on the slide, PhoneGap create, and then I'm calling mine my test project. Hit enter. This goes through very quickly. Boom, it's done. So what actually just happened here, and I'll just actually hop into, and I'll show you what this looks like. Oops. Oh, there we are. So, my test project, it created these folders, merges, platforms, plugins, and World Wide Web. You'll see that here in just a moment, and I'll show you why that matters. So here's the file structure. Deja vu. Within this file structure, platforms is where all the compiled versions of your apps go. So PhoneGap, the idea behind it is you have a single source repository. So you build it once, build and deploy to multiple devices. This is actually a departure from the way it used to work. So in the www folder, you'll see there's an index, HTML, config, CSS. So this is kind of your central point to create your app using, again, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, other libraries that you may want to add to it. And then you'll have an opportunity to say, okay, PhoneGap, I want you to build for iOS. And in that platforms folder, it'll drop an iOS folder and dump out a project specifically for Xcode. Like, well, I want to do this for Windows Phone 8. So you'll say PhoneGap build, WP8. Same thing. It's going to drop a folder out there. You can import that in Visual Studio and run it in an emulator or run it on the actual device. So here's the kind of build. Again, pretty simple command-like structure. No big surprises here. And this is just a little shot of it actually building. And I'll show you, just to prove it's the non-smoke and mirrors variety. So here is this, and I will actually do a PhoneGap. You know what? I have to be in the directory, don't I? So I'm going to go into my test project, and I'm going to say PhoneGap or HomeGap if you don't know how to type correctly. Build iOS. Detects that, oh, I'm on a Mac platform, so I've got the iOS stuff that I need, builds it out, and it's a done deal. So right here, it's actually trying to build, you know what, I'll cancel this out. It's trying to build for remote. Sorry about that. I thought I had this set up. Local build. Oh, so I have an old Xcode version for this one. So that's a little problematic. Here, what I'll show you is the ETG app that we do have set up. If I can find it. Yeah, it's like, which one of the ones is it, right?
Yeah, ETF there.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Oops. Okay, so this one has been built out, and you can see, oops, pluralize. There's an Android and an iOS folder in here. I'll open this up so you can see it in a more clear view. So in the Android one, it has all the specific project properties files and things like that that you can suck right into, I'm using the name, Eclipse is commonly used to build these. And so if you look at that file set, you'll see it changes when I go to iOS. Okay, so here's the Xcode project. I can open that right up, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like here in just a moment. Okay. So running the app. So I've got a couple different examples here just to show you. So both of these platforms have emulators built into it if you open up this type of project. So for Visual Studio, they have the emulator. You just can find it right up there in the menu. For iOS, it's the second image here, where you just open up the project and you basically hit play. And I'll show you exactly what that looks like. It's important, and I wanted to take a note here, to remember that now it's actually split the code out to all the specific platforms. So those are copies of your central source. You may be tempted that while you're doing emulating and trying to debug to modify your source code within that project, it will not modify your central source. So next time you go to build, you've lost all the work that you've done. So that's a little bit of a problem, right? So just always make sure that you go back to this www folder, and I'll show you again what that looks like. So this is the actual Xcode environment that we're looking at here. And I will bring up Xcode. So here's Xcode, and I have actually our eImagine employee app on here, and this was created with PhoneGap. It's actually recently upgraded to the newest version. And you'll see I have iPhone, iOS 6.1, so that's the kind of platform it'll emulate. And I'll run this, and sure enough, it brings up a little emulator version of an iPhone. This is a splash screen that's loading into it. And this probably looks familiar to people in the room, hopefully. And so this is running our app using the PhoneGap framework. So you can kind of click through and kind of say, oh, okay, so this is how it works. In this specific instance, I'm using jQuery Mobile as the UI framework. So it's what helps kind of create the button structure and makes things look a little more native. Otherwise, you know, it could be a pretty flat looking and obviously HTML kind of a website just encapsulated in this app. And I'm actually going to back out here and just show you. So there's the ETG app, and as you can see, it has its own app icon. It's customized. It looks native. It's not a big surprise to anybody, you know, what behaviors you're going to find when you run this. Same thing on Android. It'll create the icons. All you're doing is specifying, here's an image I want you to use, and it will split those out and install it. So for all intents and purposes, when you put this out on the App Store, you put this somewhere, even if it's enterprise distributed, when the person installs it, they may not even know that this is really kind of a faux native app, because it will have all those same behaviors and things that they've come to expect. So I'm just going to pause this. We'll go back here. Okay, cool. So you're like, all right, man, I got PhoneGap installed. I got the frameworks installed. Everything looks like it's cooking along. How do we move forward from here? And I've talked a little bit about using a UI framework such as jQuery Mobile. You can use anything that you find out there. I know that Twitter's Bootstrap is really popular, and a lot of other companies have come out with little kind of Bootstrap UIs that you can use that just kind of do a lot of the legwork for you, even just with web work. If you're developing a mobile-targeted website, those same things will apply when you're creating the web app, or excuse me, a mobile app. So one of the next things you may want to do is like, well, I don't want the default code in there. Got to do something about that. You may want to create a client-side database, and you know what? To really make this thing whiz-bang, we got to connect up to some web services. So as promised, I'm not going to go into huge detail and tell you how to write these, but I wanted to capture these in a slide. This is the basic structure for getting into a database. And this is, again, you'll recognize this as JavaScript, maybe, if that's your flavor. So just creating a handle to the database and starting a transaction. I pass in a function that I'm going to use, create my tables, what to do if it fails, what to do if it succeeds. And then within this function, I'm taking the specific transaction and I'm executing plain old SQL. So in this case, I'm creating a table. If it doesn't exist, we're calling it people. and we're putting some fields in there. ID, first name, last name, null that you see here, and it'll be kind of consistent. This is an opportunity for you to pass parameters. This particular query that we're using doesn't need them. And then when this specific piece runs, I could say, I want you to go out and run create people success. If it doesn't, I want you to go to create people fail, so that I have an opportunity to say, especially during debugging, okay, what went wrong? Are they out of storage space? And I can react accordingly, make a little pop-up, say, hey, you're out of storage space. We couldn't create the tables we need. We're not going to be able to move forward. Or maybe it's a kind of inconsequential command, and we just say, we're just going to ignore it and move on. I'm also creating a settings table. Again, very similar structure. And down here, you can see I have my success and fail functions and things like that. This is alive and well in the ETG mobile app. So when we sync down employees, when we sync down tweets and settings, and even the first time you log in and we authenticate you, we're saving this information to a database, and I run through this similar routine and say, if these tables don't already exist, create them, insert some data, and move along. If you've already logged in once before, I'm doing a query as soon as you launch the app to say, hey, do they already have a token in here? So we don't have to bug them with a login screen. So again, you have full database access here, and it uses SQL, which is something you're probably familiar with. So no big barrier to entry when it comes to that. Here's some things that you have to be aware of with database access. You have to wait for this event called document ready. The good thing about this is PhoneGap comes pre-wired with these events in its JavaScript file, so you don't have to guess at what that looks like. It's already got it well commented and waiting for you. Size matters, right? So under Android, iOS, and Windows, they each kind of have their own kind of platform restrictions that say out of the gate you're only allowed to use so much space without requesting more. This goes way back even to HTML5. So that spec kind of says by default it's 5 megabytes. Not a lot of space, especially when you consider in our particular application we're pulling down images. Well, it doesn't take very long for your employee roster with images and all these other things to clog up a database and expand well beyond 5 meg. The good news is that a lot of platforms, they've relaxed this so that you can get 50 meg without asking the user for it. But that's also kind of something interesting to know as a consumer, that on your phone, these apps are capable of kind of creating these little databases without you knowing it up to a certain size. So it's just a caveat that as you're testing, if you find that, I get this reaction on an Android device, but I don't see this when I'm on my iPhone or iPad, that's a consideration to think, oh, well, that could be the trigger mechanism there. Version matters. So you can actually specify database schemas, and I don't want to get too heavily into that. That's very technical, but you can actually test and see if database schema 1, which maybe only has those 2 tables that we just saw created. Well, since then, what we've gotten wiser and decided we're going to store more on the client device. So now there's 5 tables. You can specify that that's V2 of the schema, and PhoneGap has methods for you to say, what schema am I on? Do I need to run this upgrade script? So you don't constantly have to, basically have people remove the app completely, reinstall, and then potentially lose the data that they already had on the device. Asynchronous may feel foreign. What that means is all the actions, and this will be repeated several times, all the actions that you see in JavaScript for database access, network access, so on and so forth, are done asynchronously, which means they happen kind of behind the scenes. With a normal procedural language, and even in JavaScript, you may be expecting something to come back before it executes the next command. It's not the case here. So those transaction commands that I showed you earlier will actually happen kind of behind the scenes, asynchronously, while my code continues to execute. That may think, well, why does that matter? Well, if you're expecting those tables to exist and it hasn't finished creating them yet, you could easily get to an error. If you're expecting data that you kind of pre-populate and seed in there to exist, and you go to call it back out, you could run into an error. So you have to have little checks and balances along the way, and that's why those kind of callbacks that say, yes, this succeeded or this failed are important. Those can be your cues to okay, let's move forward now and do the next item. Spelling of function names. I get pretty sloppy with this myself. I kind of come from the VB.NET world. So sometimes I think, oh, you know, as long as something has the same spelling but not necessarily the same capitalization, it's no big deal. It's doubly important in JavaScript because if you specify a callback that's, you know, check this with a capital T, and you use check this with a lower t when you actually define your function, it's going to say it doesn't exist, and this thing's going to be bombing, and you could spend an hour kind of digging through code when the answer's right there in front of you. So talk about tapping into web services. This is one of the coolest things, and you know, I recently wrote a blog post about all the cool web services that you can find out on the web that are freely available to use. In this case, I made one up. There is no ws.myserver.com/employees probably, but you never know. But you can do gets, posts, you can send XML, JSON data, and this is just a little example of a call that you might make. Similar to the database stuff, when it's done, you can have it call back and say, I'm done, and here's the data I got. There's also failures, so you can say on error, I want you to do this callback and tell me what went wrong. This is the way that we contact, especially here, authentication serving back here. So we say, here's the username and password of a first-time user, Mark, for instance, you know, and they'll say, well, you know, it may kick back, say, error, it was just the wrong password. That's not what we have on file. Okay, so then I can present that to the user and get an opportunity to fix it, call this again. Oh, you got it right this time, and here's your token. And then again, I can call my database code, say, save that token for later. I don't want to bug him about his username and password every time he comes on this thing. But we are going to check the web server periodically and say if Mark actually still works here. So if he leaves, we want to make sure we revoke his access. Web services are really powerful. You've seen, you know, Google Maps, Apple Maps, Bing Maps, if that's your flavor. All these things can be called from within this application to get back location data. Here's where you are. Here's the address that you want to go to. And here's kind of the route to take. And all that data can come back and be shown visually on a map with, again, readily available code examples that are done on websites. You can plop those exact same things in here and run them with very little, if any, modification. Things to be aware of with the web services. And Ben, you'll remember this one, parameter names and calls to WCF. This happened to me, this bit me recently. So if you're using a .NET backend, specifically WCF to kind of filter and manage your web service calls from this PhoneGap app, you want to make sure that your parameter names match exactly what your objects are that you're sending in. Everything is asynchronous. I feel like I've said that once before. So if you're expecting like PhoneGap to sit there and wait for the call to the web service to come back and then it does something magical, you better start using those kind of completed callbacks and things like that. Otherwise, this is just like any AJAX call. It happens asynchronously. So the line that comes immediately after that call will be executed probably before the data comes back. Be prepared for that. The other trick here is same origin policies and cross-site scripting. This becomes a problem if you're trying to test a debug in a browser. PhoneGap actually relaxes these policies. If you're not familiar, what this does is it says, when I'm calling a web service, I want it to be on the same domain as where the website is. Well, that doesn't really work very well when you're essentially on a website that's on a device that has no domain, so it's nothing. So if it tries to call any other web service, that breaks the same origin policy. It's not coming from the same place that it's calling from. Like I said, PhoneGap relaxes this, but if you're debugging using like Google Chrome, like in their console, this can be a little problematic because it'll just keep blocking your web service calls, and you can get pretty frustrated. This is just important to remember, hey, you know what, let me actually build this out to a specific device and run it in the simulator, because then it will relax those policies and you can actually see what's going on. You can also Google, there's actually some commands that you could fire up your browser with that relaxes this, but again, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we have here. So camera, I think it's just worth noting, here are some of the features, and these are kind of quick hits of things that you can access that maybe you're not so sure of. With HTML5, they're still kind of working out the kinks of how to access your native camera. So whether it's your webcam on your PC or it's actually on your device. People have typically turned to Flash to do those things because it has a plug-in and it can interface pretty well with that. Well, we're kind of trying to get away from that. The nice thing is PhoneGap puts a little kind of stub on the device when it installs your app that can allow you to access the native camera. So it looks and feels just like whatever that device's native camera app is. So it'll pull up, have the little window, little take picture button, and it can actually handle storing them to your photo album. It can actually take the output of that and do something with it in JavaScript. So recently I've been looking at doing color samples. So if you take a photo of something and you want to get kind of a color sample and say, oh, that's brown, and recognize that that's brown and do some kind of logic behind the scenes, you could do all that, and it's not a problem. You can even choose whether it comes back as a raw binary image or if it's base 64 because you're going to pass it off as text to a web service somewhere. It's important to note that you're responsible for cleanup. So on each device, they kind of have guidelines for if you store this thing in the photo album, it's your baby. If you only meant for it to be there temporarily, get rid of it whenever you're done using it. Some people forget to do that, so I just put that there as a note. And here's a quick example. This is literally the code that you could run to have it take a picture. And I tried to think of somebody who had kind of a vision, a connection to Star Trek, and I always think of Geordi. So literally in those kind of 4 lines of code, you can get a picture taken. Now you're not going to do anything with it in those 4 lines of code, but in this got picture function, you have the image data, and you can actually break into that and choose whether to save it out, what you're going to do with it. So again, trying to show you how easy it is to kind of get something that may seem pretty complex, and honestly is super complex in native platform development. Geolocation, I kind of touched upon this before. You can get a particular instance, so you run a command and you're going to say, tell me where I am in the world right now. And that's, again, assuming your device that it's running on has kind of like that GPS geolocation capability. The other cool thing is that just like your driving apps and your Google Maps and things like that you may have also installed on your phone, it can receive position updates. And you could choose the frequency with which that happens. You could say, every second, I want you to update me and tell me, have I moved? Where am I at now? Because I'm going to put that dot on a map and actually move it around and show you where you're at. You can have it do callbacks only when something does update. So you say, what, they're just sitting still. Don't constantly be hammering my function with updates if you're not moving. But you're responsible for the mapping. Out of the gate, this does not do any visual mapping. So you will, again, turn to a web service. You could turn to a framework like Google Maps or Bing Maps. Take the location data that PhoneGap's giving you, send it into that API, and display the results. Again, uses callbacks, and it is asynchronous, so you have to be prepared for that when you're coding. And here's a quick example of it actually pulling that back. And this actually is broken out quite a bit with some unnecessary things just to show you how it comes back. But this whole section could be removed if I wanted to be as concise as I was with the camera app. But literally, I'm doing it in one instance. Hey, I want you to get the current position. It would call this function, maybe located somewhere else in my code, and I could even tell you what altitude that you're at. Probably not recommended because I'm guessing to test it, you're on an airplane, and right now they frown upon that. But you can even get the heading and speed, things like that. So, pretty complex information that you're pulling right out of JavaScript. Contacts, you can even actually dig into the native contacts and create, find. Not all the fields are the same, so on Android they kind of call things a little different than they do on iOS versus what they may do on the BlackBerry, for instance. So there's a little additional coding you have to do to say, okay, if I didn't find the name or contact name, try this instead, or try this instead. The other thing you can do is, switch based on the platform type right out of the gate, and you know how to pull those in. Here's another quick example. So I'm pulling contact find options, create those, saying go get me the name, the phone numbers, and the emails, and then do a callback when you have that information. So notifications. I don't think you can have a real good app without some kind of alert or something that gives you some feedback if kind of things go awry. So you can pop up alerts and choices. So a lot of this looks very similar if you don't modify it at all. It can look and feel very much like a JavaScript alert. But you can actually decorate these. You can actually initiate vibration, beeps, If you start beeping at people, you probably get your app yanked from the App Store, unless it's meant to annoy your users. So just be a little cautious of that. But that's why I've created the function annoy me, and it actually will beep 10 times. The vibrate is actually with what frequency to vibrate. I want you to vibrate for 1,000 milliseconds. Here's a little callback that has a confirmation box, like, are you sure? And then you actually have buttons. That's what this last parameter is yes, or it'll show a button beside it that says not really. So based on what you click, it calls this back here, and if it's a 0, that means you hit yes. If it's a 1, it means you hit not really. You can react to that very quickly. Again, you can prototype this thing very, very quickly. Files. So, wow, the Files API, I will warn you, is pretty huge, and it takes a lot to get files written and read. So the database access may have seemed a little daunting, but the File API is even crazier. And it just requires an awful lot of heavy-handed coding to get things pushed here and there. A lot of this, I think, has to do with the security on the individual systems. So they're actually calling native APIs behind the scenes, which is why you kind of are doing code Olympics just to get file structure set up. One of the cool things about the File API, though, is that it does open the possibility of a self-updating app. Well, you may be thinking, well, you know what, every time I post a new version out on the App Store, that self-updates. Well, not exactly. What I'm saying is that you wouldn't actually have to publish a new version of your app out on the App Store. You could have this do a web service callback, say, is there any new content for me? Is there anything that's been updated? Oh, yeah, there is. Well, you know what? I'm going to go reach out with the web service, pull back those files, save them locally, and then in my code I'll say, oh, there's a new file. I'm going to use that instead of the one that came packaged with me. So in that way, your users have a really great experience where they're not constantly updating their app, and it's something that you can wait and do the moment they open up the app. You can say, oh, you know what, I got a few things to refresh. Do you want to do that now or not? So it's just kind of a different approach to keeping things up to date. So here's kind of the last slide here, pros and cons. And I've talked a lot about these, and I want to make sure that I impress upon you that PhoneGap is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Again, there's times when you may want to actually go out and develop these things on a native platform. The pros, you can leverage existing web expertise, right? So if you have yourself included, if you have developers in-house that know their way around HTML, know their way around CSS and JavaScript, this is a great way to turn them loose and get a really quality app put together without investing in kind of native device expertise. You can utilize native device functionality. So I showed you, camera, the geolocation, a lot of those things that you may not be able to do on a website that you can actually get done within your app. You have a single cross-platform source. So again, I can build, write my app once and build and deploy to multiple device types. You can keep UI consistency across the platform. So without, when you break into a native code, for instance, it will try to enforce things on you. You have to have a title bar here. You have to have a button here, or else we're not going to let you continue. You don't have to worry about that if you go this route. Here's the cons, though. It is JavaScript, and JavaScript's not known for having this amazing data processing ability. You're kind of being sandboxed. So it's a little slower. If you're expecting things to just be blazing fast, you may even consider like, oh, can I offload this to a server and just have it kick back responses when it's done instead of doing it client side. I noted you have limited background processing. So again, if there's things that you want to be happening silently in the background while your app is minimized or even shut off, that may be a consideration. You say, oh, this isn't a good fit. And just like UI consistency across platforms is a pro, that's also a con. So if your clients are going to expect this to, oh, I want this to look like an Android app, but I want my iOS app to look like an Apple app, that could be problematic and mean that you have to start digging in and creating flavors of this anyway. But you might as well probably do it in the native development language and just knock it out that way. If there's any questions, feel free to present them now. And if you think of it later, here's my Twitter handle and my email. Feel free to reach out to me for those. Michael?
For the ETG app, do we update? 3 slides ago, you had auto update to bring, do we have that in the ETG app?
No, so that is, so the question was, in our internal ETG employee app, if we plan on employing, or if we currently employ this self-updating functionality. We do not at present have that code in, but honestly, since discovering how great this is, it is something that I've played around with a little bit, and once we get an official sprint put together for the next round, I'm sure that that'll be included, just so that we're not all suffering kind of from constant updates whenever something happens. Andy?
I have a couple questions. One, so I work on a PC, develop on a PC, and I want to target all the major devices. So just so I'm clear, do I need to have the SDK for iPhone? And is there an SDK that sits on PC?
Right. So just to repeat the question, Andy's question is, he's a Windows developer, and he wants to know if he can still target Android, obviously Windows Phone, and iOS on his machine. And the question is, or the answer is no. The problem really goes back to Apple, and they demand that you are on Mac hardware in order to develop on their platform. So even though you can write the code, the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, and you can even test it, and make sure that's running on all the other platforms, when it comes time to build and push this thing to the App Store, you are going to have to get on a machine that has Xcode. And that's problematic for a lot of organizations. But if the nice thing about this, and where it could save a little bit, is you let everybody develop in PhoneGap, and then you have maybe a dedicated Mac Mini or a MacBook or something sitting somewhere where you're literally just pulling down using Git or TFS or whatever source repository you use. Pull down the source, do your build, and copy the files out and get back off the machine. So that way nobody has to necessarily have a dedicated Mac machine. But that really is kind of the catcher. Because for Android, for instance, they have Eclipse. That tends to be where people do their build. It's cross-platform. It's Java-based. So it runs on Windows. It runs on Mac. So when people I've talked to in the past about this, they say, well, that's where it's really convenient to have a Mac hardware to begin with, because then you can kind of, through a VM, you can target the Windows stuff, but then you can target everything else off of one box. But that's one solution to that.
I also have another question.
Yeah.
Is the PhoneGap, is it command line driven? So is there, you're doing everything command line?
Yeah, so I would say, so is it command line driven, PhoneGap? That was the question. The answer is yes. To get things set up and to start a project, it is. But from the moment that you create your project until the moment you're ready to do a build, there's really a gap in PhoneGap. You don't have to go and revisit it really for anything. One of the things, in fact, I'll take this as a moment to show you, is, okay, can everybody see that okay? One of the things that I wanted to do is show you, there's a config file that sits in here. And so in it, it describes, and you're seeing this is like an XML formatted document, but this describes what to do when it finally comes time to build on every other platform. So kind of universally, it has this namespace, it has the name of the app, a description, kind of an author email, its name. But then as you get down below, it's listing all the features and all the little preferences. So when this thing goes out and targets iOS, it will actually go through and use these, and it copies those into the project. So again, single space to actually configure this. When it comes time to hit Android, it's going to look in these different settings, and you can even see platforms. It has iOS, WebOS, WinPhone, BlackBerry, these LDPI, MDPI, these are all Android platform pieces. Splash screen, what do I do with the splash screen? Well, here's where to go get it. So when you do a build, again, it's copying these files out and kind of reformatting things. So there, other than spending honestly a couple of minutes to create the project, and then whenever it's kind of time for you to test it on the mobile app and do a build, those are the only times you have to jump to the command line and do that. In a past version, they had templates and things like that you could just download and use natively. But again, they've gone to this format because this way you can keep your source in one spot. I hope that answered your question, Andy.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure that.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Scott.
So on one of your slides, you had contacts, and you said they're called different depending on your operating system or
Yes.
device.
Mm-hmm.
So are you actually, you have to code it to say if, or case statement to say if you're iOS, then use contact, if you're Android, do this?
You do, actually. So you do a switch statement, which is a case statement in JavaScript, and that's probably the easiest way. And you can detect there's an interface called device, and you can get device dot, I think it's type, it may be name, but it actually will come back with Droid, iOS, Windows. And then from there you can actually say, okay, well then here's the string of names that I want you to go get. I want you to use contact name instead of person name, first name instead of F name. So little variations like that is where you cover that, and then you can jump out of that case statement and run the shared code, which is, hey, go out and get it, bring it back. The good news is that when it does come back, it comes back in whatever data format. It comes back with a hash, basically, of whatever those fields were called that you called for. So then you're just looping back through those and saying, oh, I found an F name, so that's what this is. So you're translating it back, once again, to some kind of standard format.
So for the ETG app, when we build it for Windows,
Yep.
you have to put that switch in there somewhere. I assume it doesn't have it.
So that's a great question. The question is if we have to put that switch in for the ETG app, and the answer is no. Actually, I don't use the contacts at all. The contacts is again, a connection to your native contacts on the device. So that means if I'm not running ETG app, I could go to my phone book and find all those people. Now that might be a cool enhancement in the future to sync contacts, and as you mentioned it, sync the contacts that are coming out of Active Directory and keep your contacts refreshed with that information. Now, Exchange Server kind of does that for you, right? So most of you have your email already on your device, and contacts is one of them, and it will keep those synced. But if you had an app where that's not happening and you still want to sync apps, contacts would be a way for me to do that. I'm storing all that information right now independently in my own database so that it doesn't mingle, cross-mingle with the contacts that are on your device. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. I'm going to check chat to see if anybody has a question. Nope. All right, guys. Well, that's it. Thank you very much for attending. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with me after this at any of the addresses or come see me in person. All right. Thanks.